I'm a policy analyst here at the Institute, and I'm so excited you've taken the time to join us today for our latest edition of our Governing Principles series. Special thanks to today's panelists, North Dakota Superintendent of Public Instruction, Kirsten Baszler, Karen Korematsu of the Korematsu Institute, and Dr. LeGarrette King of the University of Missouri for taking the time to join us today. Before we get started, I want to get going with a few logistical notes here. We'll be keeping everyone on mute throughout, but would love to hear from you. We have two ways for you to do that. A significant portion of our time is going to be dedicated to answering your questions, so please be sure to use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen, and we'll do our best to get through as many of those as possible. We also welcome you to tweet throughout. Whether you have questions or comments, please use the hashtag #GovPrinciples. Our team will be live tweeting throughout the conversation, so we really hope you'll be able to join the discussion there as well. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome the Hunt Institute's Director of Policy and Research, Daniela Doyle, to get us started. Over to you, Daniela.
Great. Thank you so much, Kyle, and thanks to everyone for joining us today. I also want to thank our panelists for making time to join us. One major misconception about social studies instruction, especially at the high school level, is that it's simply a retelling of chronological events that constitute a truth. But in reality, social studies education is about fostering inquiry-based skills like contextualization and source analysis to prepare students to critically examine established narratives and concepts, all vital skills in navigating today's most pressing issues, many of which are also the most engaging. To that end, there's been a growing call to recognize our nation's diverse perspectives, traditions, and values by ensuring students see their own stories and experiences depicted in academic material in authentic and engaging ways. This all sounds great, but what does it mean in practice? What steps should states take to effectively implement more inclusive curricula? How can teachers, parents, students, and policymakers alike navigate the politics that have come to dominate the conversation? We're so grateful to have these experts with us today to delve into these questions. So today we're excited to be joined by three fantastic experts in this space. Kirsten Baszler, who's both the North Dakota Superintendent of Public Instruction and a member of our Hunt Kane Leadership Fellows Program. Dr. Karen Korematsu, the founder and CEO of the Korematsu Institute, and Dr. LeGarrette King, an associate professor of learning, teaching, and curriculum at the University of Missouri. There's a lot to discuss today, so I want to jump right in. But before we do, I want to remind our audience that the latter half of this conversation will be dedicated to your questions. We look forward to submitting those in the Q&A throughout the discussion, and we'll get to as many as we can. Superintendent Baszler, in the spring of 2021, amidst a heated national debate over social studies curriculum, North Dakota's legislature passed a new bill requiring that Native American history be taught in K-12 schools. Can you tell us a little bit about how this came to be? How has North Dakota been able to build the coalitions necessary to drive this work forward when other states are struggling to find common ground related to representation in curriculum?
Thank you for the question, and thank you to the Hunt Institute for hosting this very important conversation. I truly appreciate it, and it's an honor to be with my fellow two panelists to have this conversation. So, essentially, there is that saying that progress travels at the speed of trust, and every good thing is rooted in the foundation of relationships. And so, as you mentioned, the piece of legislation was passed during this spring, during the 2021 legislative session, but it began many years ago, and it began by having authentic, honest, open questions and being vulnerable. Recognizing that there were differences, recognizing that there were perspectives that were missing from our schools. And with most things, the work began out of the motivation and desire to improve conditions for our students, to improve something in our state that we wanted to improve. And that was essentially the graduation rate of our Native American students. We have a high graduation rate nationally. We rate, among the top of the states. We have on average about 89–90% graduation rate overall. But in 2012, the year before I took office, the graduation rate for our Native American students was 52%. And we know that dropping out is not an event, it's a process, right? And so we couldn't be just looking at our high schools, and we needed to dig deeply into what was causing that disparity. And so researching, understanding that when students are connected to what it is that they're learning, that they have a sense of purpose or sense of being within what they are learning, that they do better. And so at that point in time, we began to work on something that we call essential understandings. And I think words matter. It isn't Native American history. It's not about, learning about tribes. It's about essential understandings for all North Dakotans about who we are as a state full of citizens. And so 2015, we began phase one of creating the framework of essential understandings. In North Dakota, we have five different tribal reservations, 5 different sovereign nations that we share our borders with in North Dakota. And I made some missteps. We can talk about those a little later. I made some mistakes, but you have to be vulnerable. As a leader, you have to be authentic in your leadership. And here we are 6 years later. We've developed, several different phases of essential understandings for all North Dakota students. And we were able to come together through those relationships built those last 6 years to effectively across the aisle work with our legislators to get this piece of legislation passed, where it was an affirmation of this is important to all North Dakota students.
Thank you so much. Dr. Korematsu, in addition to developing curriculum and providing professional development for educators, the Korematsu Institute engages in advocacy around the importance of states including Asian American representation in their curriculum, an especially vital shift as the number of Asian American hate crimes has risen. How has the Institute worked to build coalitions to address these issues, especially in states in which Asian Americans make up a smaller share of the population?
Thank you for that question, and thanks to the Hunt Institute for hosting this important webinar, because these are the types of conversations that we now need to promote. The anti-Asian hate and violence that we've seen in this country cannot just be a moment. It has to be a movement. And what's happened before is, as the superintendent said, this type of work has started really a long time ago. And unfortunately, it's, the attacks against Asian Americans has been a long part of the American history. And it's now that the media is finally has brought it to our attention. Again, we've had incidences in the past like Vincent Chin, but now, and actually because of the pandemic, let's look at maybe the obvious, and also because of the movement of Black Lives Matter that's given to support to the fight for Asian American identity and awareness. And we work on a national level, so it's a pretty big a jump as far as our outreach. But we've started with what we know, and I think that's always a good place to start for anyone who's addressing Asian American Pacific Islander history. Is with my father's story and Supreme Court case, Fred Korematsu versus United States of the Japanese American incarceration during World War II. And because of the first day, Fred Korematsu Day of Civil Liberties in the Constitution being established in California in 2010, signed a legislative bill by Governor Schwarzenegger that every January 30th in perpetuity, the governor and the superintendent of public instruction recognizes Fred Korematsu Day of Civil Liberties in the Constitution and encourages education of my father's fight for justice and that of the Japanese American incarceration of World War II and the relevancy of those issues today. That was the first day in California. Now we have Hawaii, Commonwealth, Virginia, Florida, New York City, and actually a month ago or so, Governor Ducey of the state of Arizona signed the same bill. Now it's not a holiday, but it's a start, and we all like to have holidays. But the point being, it brings attention, just like Juneteenth brings attention to the to the struggles and the racism and the prejudice of African Americans in this country. And so, that's what we know, and been able to work with state legislators. So fortunately, some states have of API history and will focus on that, and some states don't. With California, we just, thanks to our California Superintendent of Public Instruction, Tony Thurman, was instrumental in helping to establish the Ethics Studies model curriculum for the state of California. And as we have a legislative bill on the floor, that would be a mandate for a graduating requirement for all seniors to take at least one semester of ethnic studies in order to graduate in the state of California. And that's how we've included our API history is included in the ethnic studies, which I feel gives them a more overall approach to representation in the state of California, as the superintendent was talking about the representation of her citizens in North Dakota. And but in Illinois, there's two state legislators, Senator Villa and Representative Gong Gershowitz, who introduced a HB 376, which is called the TEACH Act, Teaching Equitable Asian American Community History. And thanks to the bipartisan support, it is now on the governor's desk, I think as of June 16th, waiting for his signature, which would require public elementary school and high school to include curriculum and instruction about the events of Asian American history and provide governing teacher development. And this would include the study of wrongful incarceration of Japanese Americans during World War II. And also the story of the 442nd, which is our most decorated military unit to this history today. But it also includes other Asian American Pacific Islander history, because these, there is such a big now misunderstanding of what the model minority myth means. And that's maybe another few minutes of discussion. But it's state by state. And also I'd be remiss if I didn't just add that Representative Grace Ming, Congresswoman Grace Ming of New York, has introduced HR 2283 as Teaching Asian Pacific American History Act. And if that was passed, then that would give the Department of Education the ability to help fund some of the educational programs of API history in other states. So this is kind of where we are now. It's a long road. It's going to be a longer road, but we as a superintendent said, the transparency is important. We're going to take 3 steps forward, 2 steps back, but we have to keep pushing and not give up.
Great, thank you so much. And I feel obliged to let everyone know that on July 1st, we'll actually be having a race and education webinar on the model minority myth. So thank you for flagging that, and hope that our panelists can join us and can see the registration in the link now. Dr. King, we've talked a lot about the importance of including diverse perspectives in curriculum, but how do we ensure that they're truly inclusive and don't simply attempt to fold diverse stories into established narratives that center around the white experience?
Thank you, Daniela and Hannes too, as well as my panelists here. I'm so happy to be here, and good afternoon to everyone who's listening. I hope this is more than a conversation. Hopefully we have some very powerful people in here who can, are people with some influence who can actually provide action, right? Action instead of symbolism, as well as just talking, because I don't know the complete history of Asian American history education. I don't know the complete history of Indigenous history education, nor Latinx history education, but I do know with Black history education, we've been doing this thing since after the Civil War in terms of Black educators teaching us and telling us how to teach Black history throughout the past century and a half, right? So we've had these conversations before, and it's time for action. Now, in terms of the question, how do we move past these kind of whitewashed aspects of history, right? And include particular aspects. For one, it's extremely important for us to understand what history is. We need to rethink history. And for some people, we actually need to define what history is, because a lot of people don't know what history is. History is not about patriotism. History is not about being anti-American. History education is not about all these fancy phrases we use to, so we don't repeat the past. We continue to repeat the past. So apparently we don't know what history is. History is about humanity. History is about helping us understand who is human and how we treat people humanely. Also, when we talk about diversifying notions of history, we have to understand that history is about the various different perspectives of our social cultural realities and identities. So in many ways, in terms of policy, as a country and as states who have developed standards, we believe in this notion of historical uniformity, meaning that all people, no matter what your racialized category is, your gendered category is, et cetera, that we experience history the same, and we do not. These fancy phrases like, oh, Black history is just American history, not the fantasized way in which we construct American history, is not. Even if we believe in a policy of historical integration, the real way to push forward and diversify our curriculum is to change the historical narrative. If your idea of policy is just to add brown faces, Black faces, indigenous faces, Asian American faces within the curriculum without changing the qualitative way in which we understand these people, then you're not necessarily doing a equitable history curriculum. In many respects, we need to take on a policy of historical contentiousness. And by historical contentiousness, what I mean is that these particular histories, indigenous histories, Asian American histories, Latinx histories, Black histories, are histories from those people's perspectives. What we've been doing is, particularly in notions of Black history, we have been teaching about Black history, but we haven't been teaching through Black history. Meaning that our perspectives still come from Eurocentric perspectives. In many ways, our history curriculum kind of centers this notion of what white people wish Black people were, or who they imagine Black people are, without necessarily taking that histories from their particular perspective, their voices, their perspectives, and their unapologetically understandings of who they are as a people. And when we do that, those histories look totally different because we're focusing on teaching through those particular perspectives and not teaching about those particular perspectives. The biggest problem with our history curriculum is that our history curriculum has told us that white people are the most historically important people in the world, no matter who we focus on. That's what our history curriculum teaches us. No matter what histories we teach, white people are centered in those particular narratives. Look at your state standards. We can do it both quantitatively and qualitatively. But when we teach an equitable history curriculum, right, then those particular histories look totally different. And then we come to understand that various different perspectives are very important within our understanding of our humanity, right? So, in fact, and we can go through days and days, hours and hours of talking about what history is, but a short answer is we need to rethink what history education is, and we need to understand and define what history and social studies is to our students and our society.
Thank you so much, Dr. King. I think that's a great segue to our next question, which is I invite all the panelists to respond to, which is, it's one thing to say we want to include more narratives in the curriculum and in our stories, but it's another thing to do it well. So in light of the discussions today, how would you suggest that states approach this work and find the best ways to represent the many voices that make up our collective experience?
maybe I can start, and I'll try and keep it succinct. So thanks for your comments, both of you. I think, what Dr. King just said about their authentic voices, I think that is one of the reasons I'm so very proud of the essential understandings. And thank you for putting that, the teaching of our elders, because those are actually primary resources. The foundation of the essential understandings are the recorded voices of all 5 of our tribes from their experiences. It is their experiences, and those are the resources that make the foundation. From our Lakota Dakota, from our Chippewa, from our Sioux. So it is those elders that we are hearing from and their experiences. And so I think that is a very important distinction that was made. And as I said, one of the reasons that I'm very proud of this work that we've done, because so how do you go about this? What I say to other leaders that want to have the authentic? I do believe that it is important and possible to be both proud and patriotic and honest and factual about what has happened. And so I do believe that's possible. And I believe that it's very, very important that we have culturally affirming teaching and resources and materials that are lifting up all of the cultures that are existing in this great state and this great nation. So how did we start this? And I mentioned that I made mistakes. The very first mistake that I made was bringing all of our tribes together, all of our Native Americans together to have a conversation. And I invited them to the Capitol. Wow, wasn't that wonderful of me, right? And then I realized that no, we have very distinct nations that we share our borders with. And the conversations that I was having with the Lakota and Dakota were going to be very, very different than our Turtle Mountain Chippewa. And shame on me for inviting all of them together. I needed to go to them, to their communities, to their government, their tribal council had offices, and visit with those teachers. So that's one thing. Being vulnerable, being humble, not being afraid to ask questions and say, I don't know anything about this. Can you tell me about this? And building from there. But I also think so honesty, humility. I also believe that it's very important to assume positive intent from everyone in every conversation, to assume that everyone is entering that meeting and that conversation wanting to improve and wanting to be better at this work that we're doing. The idea of partnership is very, very important to me. And a partnership isn't having a plan and bringing it to the table and saying, will you support my plan? Partnerships are coming to the table without a plan, with an idea and a goal of what you want to accomplish, and understanding that partner that you're asking to partner with to develop these types of initiatives, the movement, if you will, may have very different goals, but you have similar. So you have to not ask someone to support your plan, but agree to a long-term committed relationship of getting angry with each other, getting frustrated, but sometimes walking away from the table for moments, but always coming back. And so that's what I would say is don't develop a plan, don't develop your idea, but being honest and authentic and starting from scratch and assuming positive intent. So.
Dr. King, Dr. Korematsu, would you like to add to that?
Yeah. So the ways in which our social studies curriculum is kind of set up throughout K-12 education can be changed. We continue to regurgitate the same types of topics throughout our K-12 experience, right? I do believe that ethnic studies needs to be more ingrained within the K-12 social studies program, right? In many ways, this notion of teaching U.S. history in 3rd or 4th grade, 8th grade, 10th and 11th grade, that could change, right? Teaching about various different things from this grade to that grade, and we regurgitate in each particular area can be changed. Therefore, we will get a wide array of different perspectives throughout a child's educational career.
I liked what, or I agree with what Dr. King said about understanding our humanity, and that's why I promote ethnic studies, because that is a way of understanding our humanity collectively for all of us. Where it's also it's a history of immigration for this country as well, that people don't understand. How did we get here? What are the struggles? And all of that needs to be recognized in different communities, because we're more alike than different. We've all had our challenges, but the stories, students learn by story. They don't learn by facts and dates necessarily. It's about story. And students like to see themselves in history. I'm sure for the students, especially in North Dakota, the indigenous, tribes and the various ones there, they like to see themselves in history. And you talk about, that's how, we have this great dropout rate, which is a whole nother, webinar. But, part of that, as a superintendent touched upon, is because students don't identify with what they're learning. They don't see themselves in history, and that's important. And in order for us to get along, we need to realize that the African American struggles in some ways is similar, let's say, to indigenous, or it's about racism, it's about xenophobia, it's about, let's talk about what it is. Right. And I think it's up to, each state, of course, has its own, its own mandate, if you will. But I believe we need to approach education totally from a different direction, that we obviously, it hasn't been successful because it's been very limited. And we have a big divide in this country. And it's because of the ignorance. It's because of lack of education that I see that has been happening. Now, for everyone, it's not really complicated. You start with what you agree upon, right? You start from that point, and then go from there, because you are going to have disagreements, as the superintendent said. But we need to find those points that we agree upon. And education has been always at the bottom of everybody's list. Look at how we pay teachers, the little amount of salaries even teachers receive in this country. We look at them as second-class citizens, but we entrust our children, to educating them. But if they don't have the right tools, then it's not going to be impactful.
Daniela, may I respond to the good soup and the good doc? Yeah, so, I'm sure when North Dakota went within that phase for the indigenous, groups, and I'm so happy that the indigenous and First Nation groups around were able to help create the curriculum. I think it's extremely important, however, to realize that when we teach through these different perspectives, that these different perspectives may counter everything that you have learned about that particular history or those histories. And that is okay. In our country, we're so historically immature. For us to become historically mature is to bring these particular different perspectives within the history or social studies classrooms. So this kind of brings me back to the good doctor here, and I'm gonna push back just a little bit in that we don't have to agree, right? We have to respect these histories, right? Because just because historically you feel like you didn't experience it does not necessarily mean that historically that it didn't happen, right? I think that's where we kind of get into the problem of never changing the history curriculum, is when we say we have to agree. No, we don't. That's why historical contentiousness means that, hey, there's going to be different histories under this history. There's no one history. In many respects, we probably need to change the course names from US history or world history to US histories and world histories, to help us understand that there's not just one history. There's multiple histories that disagree with each other about or have different experiences than the other. And that's where we begin to start getting in trouble, is when we believe in historical uniformity, that there's only one history.
So I'm going to add to that a little bit as well. So as a former librarian, before my former life, I was a school library media specialist among other roles that I had, but that's where I started. I mean, part of my responsibility as a library media specialist was to help students critically analyze. And I think that's what you're talking about, is to have people debate. And, you know, so there's a lot of ELA standards in there that you have just, you know, talked about as well. And so I want to bring up the understanding, or maybe the conversation about, is it just the responsibility of our history teachers or our social studies teachers to make sure that we are growing culturally affirming school systems, whether they be public, private, or charter schools, that that our schools are places where every child, every US citizen feels like they can connect, that they are heard, that they see themselves in. And so I think we put a lot of responsibility, and I know today we're talking about, you know, history and the challenges in social studies standards, but that's not the way that we went about it with our essential understanding, which is why I think that it became less of a divisive, because it was everyone's responsibility. As we learn about the Native American culture, and that's our science teacher's responsibility in some regards. That is our Phi-Ed teacher's responsibility in some regards, as we learn about the Native American races. And I think it's every teacher's responsibility. And so that's what we have done. And how did we build? There was a question in the chat. I know we'll get to those a little bit later. How did we ensure that they had their voices? We actually brought our elders to the table before we even started and said, what do you believe is important for every North Dakota citizen to understand and know about your Indigenous culture, religion, history, beliefs? What is your wisdom? And that's where we started. So it shouldn't just be the history teachers or our social studies standards. And I think that's the framework. That's why we don't call it a social studies curriculum or a North Dakota Native American Studies curriculum. We call them essential understandings framework for the education of our students.
There's a saying in education that all teachers need to be literacy teachers, but in reality, all teachers need to be history teachers as well.
Thank you to everyone. We love when there's that back and forth. It definitely makes for great conversation. So thank you, and please continue to jump in. So we've received quite a few questions. We're talking about controversy just a little while ago in discussion, and it's difficult to discuss social studies curriculum or history today without also mentioning critical race theory and the heated debate around it. And as you might imagine, we've had quite a few questions related to CRT. So I want to ask sort of a broader question here, which is to say, how does CRT, including both the approach itself as well as discussions about it, influence the work you do and the conversations that you're having?
I know I've been outside the classroom a while, right? I was a teacher in Georgia and Texas for a little bit. But whatever this is manufactured. I don't think many teachers before all this manufactured crisis began even understood what critical race theory is, or how to utilize it within the classrooms. I doubt any kindergarten teacher is utilizing CRT in the classroom. Now, and I talk with, and I work with, and I have contracts with school districts all over the country. And one of the things we're trying to do is help teachers teach about race more effectively, right? So from my perspective, there's not this crisis of people teaching CRT, critical race theory, within the classrooms. And I think it really wastes everyone's time, for doing that. Now, having said that, how do we approach race and racism in our classrooms? And there's not a doubt in my mind that we should teach through notions of race and racism. Our country, the United States of America, has a racialized lens. Our country was built on various different aspects of racism, and our country continues to facilitate notions of racism. I could see some teachers maybe using some tenets or some principles from critical race theory, like race is endemic, right, to the American problem, and it has. If you look at various different data points, around our country, from where we live, from the education in which we receive, to the healthcare that we receive, all these factors have been based on racialized aspects. Now, yes, there's people out there, people of color, who succeeded despite those particular limitations. But at the end of the day, institutional racism is still a big proponent within our society. If it's not, then you're telling me that Black people and other people of color are just deficient. And if that's the case, just say that. But this notion of, but if we are to use a CRT lens, it would be helpful to utilize that lens to help us understand the society in which we are. See, I was going to mention this a little bit later, but we need to stop thinking of social studies as a curriculum. We're not teaching a curriculum, we're teaching citizens, right? So what is the purpose of our curriculum in our classroom, particularly with these citizens? Is it to transmit knowledge, or is it to transform our society? And hopefully it's about this notion of transforming our society for the better. So there's implications to only learning about one particular people and not learning and being miseducated about 50% of the population. If you're miseducated in schools, you become an adult who's miseducated, and you continue to miseducate society, and you take on these particular jobs in our society that will continue and transmit these problematic and systematic aspects of racism in our country, right? So I do believe that people need to really focus on, well, how do we teach race and racism effectively, right? So we can make our society better, because that's the purpose of education.
Yeah, I agree with Dr. King. It's about teaching about race and racism. It's unfortunate that we need to point out that the critical race theory issues has become politicized, and people are in some areas up in arms, going to their school boards, mandating that they can't teach critical race theory in the schools, and which is not really been a discipline that was taught there to begin with. I mean, it was CRT is not a diversity and inclusion training, but a practice of integrating the role of race and racism in society that emerged in the legal academia or academy, and spread to other fields of scholarship. And so it had to do with looking at how laws and policies have been changed. And so, the focus was in law schools and perhaps even undergrad at universities and colleges. And the fact that it's been used to create a divide again in this country. I mean, let's just look at it what it is unfortunate, because it takes away from the purpose and the opportunity. And so I think we need to, as Dr. King has pointed out, to focus on what it is about and to understand it, because most people don't. the general public doesn't. You know, then you have all these politicians, you know, using it like it was you know, against people. And it's another tool, really, another tool in our toolbox to understand about and to talk about and discuss. I mean, we can't just keep hiding behind all this, and to focus on race and racism and racial issues that keep occurring, and not to be afraid of it. I mean, what are we afraid of? Why can't we have these conversations? And you know, it's when I was talking about before about agreeing, I'm just talking about finding a starting point, because if you start with going at it at the table of totally disagreeing about everything, you're not going to get anywhere. I've been around long enough to know how this works. And we you know, we want to have education for our children. We want them to be to understand diversity and inclusion. So those are the things that I think we can agree on, and then you have to build from there. But I feel that we need to point out that we can't let critical race theory be a divide and be used as a political weapon.
I do find it interesting, however, that one of the principles of CRT is how white folk use the law to disenfranchise Black folk, and we're using the law. I'll stop making trouble. I'll just mute.
Oh, that's right, though.
So I think, you know, just to add to that, and maybe get back to the question that I heard is like, how is that conversation, how has it caused me to approach this? And so I couldn't agree with so many of the things that were just previously said, but a couple things that just stood out. School is about making our students better, you know, and creating citizens that are informed and engaged. And so what the politicization and the polar politicization of this conversation has caused me to become very precise in my language and ask people to be very precise in their questions about what it is that's concerning them, because I have yet to hear two people give me the same explanation of what they believe critical race theory is. And so the precision in our conversation is important in this. And so it doesn't take on a bigger life of its own. What is it exactly that you want, that our families want their children, all of our families want their children to learn and know, and what do our students need to learn and know, and being okay with disagreements and different perspectives and discourse, but civil discourse. And so it has caused us at the Department of Public Instruction here in North Dakota to be very intentional about these conversations and be very, again, assuming positive intent and really focusing on what all of our children need and what all of our families want for their students in North Dakota. So again, assuming that positive intent and being very precise about being able to help our students become good and intelligent debaters of issues and conversations. So that's what CRT has done for us just in the last several months.
Thank you. I think that's a great tie into our next question, which comes from one of our participants. As we're working to create a more equitable approach to K-12 curriculum, how can we also educate the adults who have influence over our children, right? Because they are in many ways the linchpin in a lot of the discussions that we're having.
So some of the things I've been doing with the school districts I've been working with is having community spaces where we talk about, the curriculum, and we talk about various different things that that we're adding, right, to various different, curriculum. And that has helped a lot in terms of saying if people come with positive intent, right? For those who really would like to learn about, well, what's going on, like what is these new histories, that we're infusing within the curriculum. So these community meetings have been very very good and well intended for various different parents, as well as just the general public, because as we said, right, what's being spewed politically, right? There's a lot of different things going on. And, you know, to have a clear voice, and then having someone from the outside, right, versus people from the inside, you know, facilitate these things have been very helpful. You know, helpful to educating adults. Also, I run a center called the Carter Center for K-12 Black History Education. So we have professional development for, you know, everyone who would like to learn about various different notions of Black histories. And also we have a large conference as well in July. So there's various different spaces where adults who are serious about learning about these topics can learn.
So I think there's a lot. I think we could do several different webinars on some of the topics that I'm going to touch on right now. But the first thing that I would need to say is that K-12's role, PK-12's role is to educate students, you know, from 4 to 18 or 21 or whatever it might be. So I do need to stay in my lane with that being said, I need to partner with our systems of higher ed. I need to partner with our Department of Health and Human Services that are family engaged. And so that's where I'm going to go into, I think, what could be a completely different webinar, and that's family engagement. And I will say that historically, at least in North Dakota, K-12 schools have not done a great job of including families and involving families. And you hear that parents that, you know, are involved in Head Start, they feel so engaged in their children's education, and then they bring them to the kindergarten door and the principal says, okay, we got it from here. So I think that we have a long way to go in making sure that our families feel part of their child's educational journey in kindergarten through 12th grade. And so what we have done in North Dakota is I've created a family cabinet, and COVID, you know, has shown us all as a nation, I think, that we can't do this alone. If K-12 schools were going to do this alone, wouldn't we have done it by now? Like, what are we waiting for, right? And so we need to do a better job of making sure that we are better partners with our families. And when we do that, when we create opportunities for our families to become involved in their child's school, that's a way that we can reach adults as well. And so that's what we are really, really focusing. And I'm not talking about family, you know, spaghetti night or whatever, you know, I'm not talking about a night. I'm talking about day-to-day interactions, partnerships with families and school systems, learning together, again, being vulnerable, being honest, helping, really authentically saying, I don't know what's best for your child. Can we figure it out together? And being authentic in those conversations. So that's how I think we can help change the generation or educate quality citizens of the students that we have right now, while helping change communities in that effort as well. So.
Because of the pandemic, I had parents reaching out to us at the Korematsu Institute, especially for our curriculum, because in the past, our curriculum that's been on our website has been only accessible by teachers and educators. And this was this big cry from parents, you know, help, help. I mean, obviously, then all of a sudden they were responsible for homeschooling. So we changed our policy totally and actually redid our website so that parents could access our curriculum and ask questions. Also put one of my father's documentaries up there. Also information about PBS learning media that they could also access. So try to make some of these resources accessible. Also, you know, I've been working all along with the you know, parent, teacher, student, you know, bodies, associations for different schools and different school districts as a way to reaching out to them to learn what their needs are. I think it's having public programming that we've done across this nation to make sure that it includes, you know, students and families and other, and you know, other communities. I mean, not just Asian American communities, but all communities. And it's broadening our outreach and being purposeful in educating, because I've realized that parents, especially when it comes to Asian American history, they didn't get a lot of that in school. They're kind of learning along with their kids. And so, which is, at the end of the day, what we're trying to promote is civic engagement. That's the point of our education, is to make better citizens of people now, adults, but also the children growing up in the schools. So they're the ones that can make the changes in the policy and be civically engaged and part of their communities to make change. And this is not just, you have to focus on the whole, not just the part. And so that's what I've been, trying to increasingly do, through our work.
Great. And a couple of times during this conversation, y'all have touched on the fact that part of the purpose of schooling, and certainly social studies education, is around creating citizens and informed citizens. Carrie Swar from the Bloom Ed Group asks, how are the panelists thinking about service learning and using it for students to address systemic racism in their communities?
I think that will be an excellent, thing for students to, engage with. I don't know how safe it is right now during our pandemic, in terms of service learning, but once we get the AOK, I believe that will bring a different perspective, right, for various different things. The only thing is, right, it's kind of like the, oh my gosh, what's the program that the students go and volunteer overseas or something like that to third world countries, is that sometimes we have this kind of savior mentality, right? So the service learning opportunity will have to be crafted in a way that it's a learning opportunity. It's not a saving opportunity, it's a learning opportunity. And we're learning from those particular communities, right? In terms of the educational value of the service learning component.
Yeah, even for Martin Luther King Jr. Day, I mean, it is they're promoting service and service learning, and so even through the Fred Korematsu Day of Civil Liberties and Constitution, we're doing the same. I think it's about generating these programs that gets students involved in their communities, whether it's helping to do something in their own school or go to some other place. I mean, like Dr. King said, when it becomes safe, but we were doing that before the pandemic. And also to have the ability for these students to have different experiences, collectively, I think is what we need to continually support. So, we're still trying to get out of this pandemic. So it's going to be another year. I mean, let's face it. But I think we want more schools to emphasize, and then sometimes these holidays can help to generate that type of movement, even for Cesar Chavez Day, or whether it's Rosa Parks Day. I mean, these are opportunities to help students be involved in their communities, and it's we're trying to create these programs that'll be more purposeful and have the opportunities that these students can learn, to learn what it means to be involved in your communities, which is going to make them, as we said, better American citizens, civically engaged.
So in North Dakota, it's actually a requirement of graduation in order to graduate choice ready in North Dakota. So again, each school district, as a state leader, we don't go in and say this, but as school districts, set those parameters, set that structure, and generally it's a requirement that it's a student's responsibility to identify something within their community where they want to make a difference. And again, the foundation of that is that helping our students begin to realize that they can't just be consumers as a citizen. They need to be providers, and they need to contribute, whether it be their local. Many of our many of our EMT, our first responders, our fire departments are all volunteer basis. You can imagine that's, if most rural parts of the nation is like that. I just learned a statistic that 85% of all firefighters in the nation are volunteer fire departments. And so those types of things. And so identifying within our own, students must identify what they want to work on, but it is a requirement of our, and it's part of our Every Student Succeeds Act accountability chart. So we embedded that into the accountability for our high schools, that they must graduate our students choice ready, not just with a diploma, but choice ready for life after high school. And part of that portrait of a graduate for North Dakota is their understanding of being a contributor to their communities in that civic way. So that's what we're doing here.
Great. Thank you so much. So we have just a couple of minutes left. I have one final question. What strategies would you give our audience today for communicating around this topic with their representatives, especially those with whom they may not align politically?
So I think maybe I'll go back to, how the first question of how we actually got this bill passed. You have to find out what drives. Not all legislators are education committee members, right? But there is one thing that seems to just bind everyone, and that's the economic argument. And the economic argument that we brought forward again and again and again is, as North Dakota citizens, our state will never be the greatest state that it can be unless we all do better. So when we all do better, we all do better. And that was the economic argument. We were able, by coming together to say we all do better, we were able to raise that graduation rate from 52% when I took office to 76% for our Native American students. That is not 100% where we want all of our students. But when we have more students graduating choice ready to be contributing citizens of North Dakota does better. And so that would be how I would approach it.
Yeah, that's great advice. Also, people don't realize, they get very intimidated about trying to reach out to their legislator. And they don't, this is part of, I think, our civics education that needs to be ramped up, is that every time you contact your local legislator's office, whether you send an email, make a telephone call, write a letter, that's on record. They have to look at their constituency, right? And you may find someone in a different part of your state that you think is doing a great job, let's say, or is on the education committee. Don't be afraid to contact them. And go, now that, most people have access to Google or to the internet, do some research, and then inform your own committee. Sometimes it's very scary to do these things by yourself. So find the like-minded, either parents or neighbors or whoever that you want to address these issues, to make these changes, and work together. I'm trying to promote more of that, because people are so intimidated about doing this by themselves, and they don't have to. Or find those other groups, other organizations, reach out to them, look to see what they're doing, where you can be a part or to volunteer for that organization. So there's different ways to participate. You just need to direct your energies into those places that are going to sustain this goal.
Dr. King, you get the last word today.
Oh no, just as we begin to have these conversations and action, that follows, just to ask, what is the purpose of education, right? What is the purpose of education to our society, right? And if we're happy with the ways in which we, ignore certain voices, then that's not part of our mission, right? We have this notion of patriotism, but when our patriotic documents has a mission statement for our country. And if we're not necessarily connecting with our mission statement of our country, we're not doing it right. So we have to really explore how we can educate all of our citizens, right? And respect these various different voices. There was a few comments and questions about the Carter Center. I put some stuff in the chat. Please follow me on Twitter. You will see all that information if you're interested in joining over the 600 educators that's going to attend the Teaching Black History Conference this summer.
Great. And we can also include some of that information in our follow-up to everyone who registered today. So thank you very much, Dr. King. Thank you to all of our panelists, Superintendent Basler, Dr. Karamatsu, Dr. King, for taking the time to share your perspectives. We're sorry that we couldn't get to all your questions today, but please feel free to tweet it to us using the hashtag GovPrinciples to keep the conversation going. On your screen, you'll see our slate of upcoming webinars. We have a number of series that span the education continuum, so we truly have something for everyone. We hope to see you again on Zoom very soon. And finally, at the conclusion, in a moment, you'll be brought to a survey page. We ask that you please share your thoughts with us so we can continue to make this series a success. Thank you again to everyone. Have a great day.